I'm Thanasi Kambanis, Director of Century International. Welcome to Order from Ashes, the foreign affairs podcast of the Century Foundation. Today, I'm talking with my friend and colleague, Rohan Advani, who's a fellow at Century International and also is writing his doctoral dissertation at the University of California in Los Angeles about the financial tools of state power. He's been studying the sovereign wealth funds and political economies of the Gulf monarchies for years and years, and he brings a really deep and regionally grounded perspective in how things operate in the Gulf. And he's been a really helpful and invaluable guide in reminding us at Century and a lot of others as well to look at the complexity of these really powerful but often misunderstood Gulf monarchies, not to see them as big pots of money or as endless piggy banks for different people's political schemes around the world, but as complex societies that are involved in all kinds of internal and regional domestic and local political calculations, which affect what they do and often are being shaped by calculuses that really escape the notice of outside powers. Rohan, thank you so much for coming on Order from Ashes.
Thanks so much, Thanasi. Glad to be here.
I want to start, and I really want to spend this time we're talking together, helping you ground us in that missing perspective of how things look from the Gulf and how these Gulf governments are understanding and responding to the great changes underway as a result of Trump's war on Iran. And I was hoping you could start by giving us a little bit of a tour, an overhead tour of how things have changed for the pivotal and most influential of these monarchies in the wake of the kind of loss of innocence engendered by this war.
Yeah, I think we can't obviously underestimate the impact of this war and how it's fundamentally reshaped the region and in many ways the world as well. Um, I think for a long time, uh, the the growing power of the Gulf states obviously was buttressed by oil wealth. That dates back to the 20th century, but I think more recently the oil boom, or the second or third oil boom of the early 2000s, really saw a lot of money flowing into this region. And unlike in the 1970s, where a lot of this money was recycled um, through Western financial institutions, through what was famously called petrodollars, in the oil boom of the early 21st century, there was a concerted effort to change the economic structure of the Gulf countries. And so this was effectively a new developmental model where Gulf countries want to diversify away from oil, build up new industries, new sectors, whether that be in manufacturing or tourism or technology and everything, um, and global finance. And crucial to this was the idea that the Gulf was a safe place, right? That it was a fundamentally safe place for investors to come, for people to migrate to, for people to like move their lives to, right? And have a stake in the region. And I think that really, um, I don't want to be all doom and gloom about it, or in any sense, but um, that reputation has definitely taken a massive hit with the outbreak of the war. Um,
Well, in order to explore this question of how much the last month and a half of conflict have changed that Gulf model, I think it'll pay to delve a little bit deeper into your understanding of that model as this last, say, quarter century has evolved. I mean, the original knock on the Gulf by a lot of people who lived there and were stakeholders in that society themselves, as well as people outside, was that these were societies that had more money, or not societies, these were governments that had more money than they knew what to do with, and not enough capacity even to manage their own local sort of municipal issues, much less the functions of a state. Essentially, families that became very rich by accidents of geography because they were sitting on top of all this oil and hadn't really kept up with the largesse or the sort of boom that came as a result of that oil wealth. Now, in reality, that was maybe true or partially true 50 years ago. That certainly hasn't been true for a long time. And I feel like even in the region among governments and people who have really intimate ties to the Gulf. Families work there. The states largely depend on not just aid, but investment, mutual investment, and remittances for these countries. There still is a kind of lazy shorthand for these kingdoms, for these monarchies, and it's not really accurate anymore. So, can you go a little bit deeper into what these monarchies have evolved into with this new development model that you just started to describe, with their sovereign wealth funds, with their burgeoning roles as technology investors, as trade entrepôts, and with their varying levels of success at creating economies that aren't just oil economies?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there, but um, you're absolutely right that the idea that these are, simply oil-rich states who don't know what to do with um, the money that they have, I think is ultimately an outdated one if it ever really was accurate. But I think effectively what has happened is that there has been an internal concerted effort to basically keep more of the money that they generate from hydrocarbon wealth in the region, right? And now there's only so much that the local economy can only absorb so much, right? So obviously the majority is often going to be, in some cases, going to be invested outside. But there definitely has been that shift to build up a local economy that's not simply reliant on oil. And of course, there's been varying success. So in some cases, if you look at the small states such as the UAE and Qatar, um, they have the benefit of having a lot of surpluses with a very relatively small population. And the citizen population in each country is relatively small. So the pressures to employ people, employ their own citizens, are far lower than, for example, in Saudi Arabia. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, it's a much bigger problem. Unemployment rates among citizens are higher, and so there has been this push to kind of vitalize the domestic economy, to increase consumer spending, infrastructure build out, um, uh, to basically absorb capital and to also create jobs and to create new industries. So some of the industries that obviously got going with quite a lot of success, I would say, I mean, real estate is obviously always one that's tied to oil wealth, but I think logistics and global finance have been very important sectors that these states have really developed, right? And so they're basically building on their status as, or they're trying to become these global nodes um, in the world economy. The Jebel Ali port, for example, in Dubai, is one of, or if not the biggest transshipping port in the Middle East. So much of trade from Africa and even parts of Europe to China flow through the Jebel Ali port. Similar projects have been developed in Saudi Arabia, for example. And then the other one I spoke about is global finance. And so, there's been a real move to set up these international financial centers, whether it be DIFC in Dubai, or ADGM in Abu Dhabi, or the other international financial center in Saudi Arabia. And here, this is really, expanded in the past, I would say, 3 to 4 years, where you're starting to see global hedge funds, global private equity funds, asset management firms all setting up offices in the Gulf. And the previous story was that because the Gulf was seen as this place with excess capital. The uh, the old model used to be a fly in, fly out model. So bankers from London or Wall Street would fly in to Abu Dhabi, for example. They'd have their meeting, they'd get a check cut, and they'd leave that night. And the change is that now you have to set up here. We no longer want this fly in fly out model. We want these these large firms that are on Wall Street or in the city of London to be set up here in Abu Dhabi or here in Riyadh or here in Doha, for example, and to really have a stake in the development of these countries. And then the last sector I would say that I think sometimes gets unnoticed but is extremely important is uh, all of the downstream products from oil. So this could be anything related to petrochemicals, um, and the Gulf has actually been very, very successful in um, uh, in domestic production of more downstream products.
Are we talking about
Um,
things like fertilizer and jet fuel,
exactly,
or are we talking about
exactly.
plastic, precursor plastic pellets? What's
It
the
it's actually all of it.
ranger?
It's actually all of it. So it's fertilizers, it's plastic that goes in anything from consumer packaging to industrial production, helium, which is used in the production of semiconductors. So we're talking about a region now that of course it's crucial to oil, but it's also crucial for the everyday things that make our life what it is, right? Global food prices are going to be affected by this. Industrial, the production of semiconductor chips are in some ways affected by this. So, you know, the story of the Gulf in the past 20 years is a story of the world coming into the Gulf and the Gulf becoming really part of the world.
Well, and is this a departure from global norms in the era of modern capital that what we have here is a region that was being extracted from that has maybe apparently successfully through its own agency repositioned itself as a region that refused to be extracted from, and that the sort of that it used the leverage of this vast amount of wealth it had to force seemingly more powerful countries to do what was in the interest of the country of the oil-rich countries that the more developed countries were trying to exploit.
Yeah, I think I mean, I wouldn't go as so far as to say that it's a complete exception or departure, but I would say it's likely not the norm. And if we think about this in sort of macro historical terms, right? I mean, we see similar things in East Asia, of countries moving up the value chain, but definitely in terms of if we look at this concept of classic extraction economies, yeah, then I think we could say that the Gulf, in contrast to many other areas of the world, um, uh, has been somewhat of a relative departure in that um, it has really come to control the extraction of its own resources and the production of new products as well.
So, uh, when we think about I mean, so we're talking about the Arab monarchies, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, uh, and Kuwait, I guess. I'm leaving a couple out, but the sort of powerful countries here are a small handful. So, not Bahrain, not Oman, Yemen, not a driver of these kinds of trends because it's a poorer country at war. So I think we are basically talking about four countries. Is that right? Saudi, UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, and thanks for that corrective. I think the most extreme examples of this are probably um, Qatar and the UAE, and Saudi to some extent. Um,
So
yeah,
sorry, go ahead and finish your thought, and then I was going
yeah,
to
yeah.
move to the
Whereas
safety question.
no, sure. Whereas I think I think you see iterations of this in Bahrain and Oman, but they are just not to the same extent, right? It's not as flashy, or it doesn't meet the headlines every day in the same way that you see about stories in Abu Dhabi, for example.
So we've seen headlines since this war started. You know, the Dubai model is dead. I mean, there've been a whole series of variations on this theme I mean, there's I think silly versions of the argument, but the serious version of the argument, as I understand it, is that this function that the Gulf states have assumed, which is a combination of being able to serve as an entrepot, being the source of these precursor materials, and also the holder of this great wealth, is a function that other geographies in the past have opportunistically been able to seize. Thinking, Singapore in an early era, Lebanon in an era before that, Cyprus, Switzerland. So that according to this argument, once safety is removed from the equation, right? Once this war between Iran, Israel, and the United States reveals that the Gulf is not a physically safe place for all these internationals to come and live and do this business, that this agglomeration of wealth creating activity will just move elsewhere. If not overnight, over the course of the single digit years, maybe decade to come, that even the Gulf states themselves will, despite their own interest in developing their own economies, want to offshore their wealth to a safer place. How do you take that argument, and how seriously should we take the notion that safety is the can lead to the movement of this thing, that this thing is portable, and two, how seriously should we take the idea that a period of war uh, actually changes the calculus in the long term for everyone from the South Asian laborers to the international bankers.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's the way you set it up is a really helpful way to think about it. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to announce the funeral of the Gulf or anything like that. I don't think that's gonna happen. I mean, at the end of the day, we are talking about a region which, especially some of the states, have an inordinate amount of wealth, which can act as an important financial buffer. And obviously, we have to see how this thing will play out. But I think that we can't ignore and pretend that nothing has changed. It clearly has. You're absolutely right that you know to be a global node is preconditioned on this idea of safety, on this idea of freedom of movement of capital and of goods, um, and to some extent of labor, right? Maybe in a more constrained way. And in all of the other examples that you raised, I mean, it was absolutely key, right? Singapore's position as a transnational shipping hub, for example, is preconditioned on the fact that there is safety, that the Straits of Malacca are open, and this is not a hostile zone. Part of the reason that Beirut is no longer the financial center of the Arab world is because of the Lebanese civil war. Um, so I think that's absolutely true. Now, whether war actually changes the calculus again, I think we'll have to just wait and see how this conflict plays out. But you know, one way to think about it is the rise of these small states as important nodes in the global economy was very much a 20th century phenomenon, which was built on, as I said, the freedom of movement of goods and capital. I think
And also based
now,
on their huge pool of capital
absolutely,
because of oil
absolutely,
wealth, right? I mean,
yes,
that's the
yes.
crucial difference. Other entrepot states in history were financializing the resources of others, but they didn't have that kind of big pool of capital of their own under their own control.
No, that's very true. Um, but nonetheless, I think that in an era now of, let's say, relative U.S. decline or kind of multipolarity, and where the where the new rules of the global order haven't been written, I think that that does pose a strategic threat, at least, to this sort of model of being a global node, right? And that's not just um, contained to the Gulf. I mean, I think other states like Singapore, example, feel that too, right? Just to this might be a little bit off topic, but um, just as an anecdote, I um, I was in Singapore back in March 2025, and this was just before the tariffs were being announced by Trump, and it was election season in Singapore. And every election rally I went to, all the politicians, both the ruling party and the opposition party, were talking about how tariffs are an existential threat to Singapore. You know, and so it just shows you how much the uh, you know global stability matters to the developmental visions of these small states.
I'm Thanasi Kambanis, Director of Century International, and I'm talking today to Rohan Advani, a fellow also at Century International and a PhD sociology student writing his dissertation on the financial tools of states. He's helping us better understand the way the Gulf, the Arab Gulf monarchies are navigating this perhaps existential threat to the model that's made them so important to the global economy and to regional Middle Eastern security. Uh, Rohan, I don't know if it's premature to change tack a little bit, but I wanted to ask you to unpack a little bit how the intra-Gulf politics and disputes shape this, because again, even sophisticated regional observers sometimes lump these rich states all together, or maybe they have a vague sense that one state is more welcoming for this kind of engineering job or is more friendly to their local government than another one, but they don't really tend to think of them as distinct political entities with very definitive internal rivalries. So, give us a little bit of a sense of that power map.
Absolutely. That's Thanks for that question. And to be honest, if I myself, make this mistake, it's hard to, um, you know when to talk about them as a coherent region, because that sometimes makes sense versus as individual states with their own interests that can often diverge. I think in this case, we are. So it was quite interesting. Prior to the outbreak of the war, um, there were a lot of stories coming out about the growing rift between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And that was partly related to what was going on in Yemen and in Sudan. And we'd sort of known about the story. Then the war broke out, and that seemed to sort of fade away, right? And the region kind of came together in solidarity um, against Iranian attacks. But I think we're now seeing those rifts open up again. And I think that this is partly related to their how they're being affected by the war, and then also I would say more related to their pre-war positions towards Iran. So very broadly, I would say that um, Oman and Qatar, who historically had closer relations with Iran, are pushing for much more de escalation. On the other side, you have Bahrain and the UAE, which both who have normalized relations with Israel have a much more hostile relationship with Iran, and they are pushing for, there were statements coming out that the U.S. should finish the job, because they are really not happy with a situation where you have a ceasefire. I mean, I'm sure they're of course happy to not be bombed, but strategically they don't want a position where you have a ceasefire, but Iran now basically has control over the Strait of Hormuz. And then you have Saudi Arabia that's somewhere in the middle. And I think the Saudi Arabia one is really interesting because, on the one hand, it's economically slightly less affected, um, by the war than the countries that are firmly in the Persian Gulf, right? It can still, it has pipelines. It can still export from the Red Sea, and I
Until the
don't.
Houthis shut it down.
Well, yes. So that's the other thing, right? So Saudi Arabia really has an interest in keeping its ceasefire with the Houthis going on, and trying to extend that. And so, and I think I read somewhere that effectively whatever oil output Saudi Arabia has lost from the war, it's sort of gained in terms of price from increases in price because it can still export from the Red
So
Sea.
the war has been revenue neutral for Saudi Arabia, whereas
Yeah,
for a
I mean
place like Qatar, maybe it's been catastrophic.
whereas
And
Qatar, I mean, yeah, relative to Qatar and the UAE and Bahrain and Iraq, it's not been as bad for Saudi Arabia. Um, and I think that partly informs their position. So you're seeing now, for example, Saudi Arabia, it entered into it engaged in some sort of détente with Iran a few years back. I think it's realized that the U.S. is not going to be this security guarantor that it may have thought it was, and it's interesting to see now the relations that it's really accelerating with Turkey, Pakistan, and Egypt. These broader like defense alliances, because I think it realizes that it Iran is not going anywhere, and the U.S. is not going to be the security partner that it wants it to be. And so, in this act of hedging, it's also diversifying its defense partnerships. And to be honest, even we're seeing that a bit with the UAE and Qatar, for example, too, right? So when Zelensky came to offer military expertise on drone interceptions. Abu Dhabi's leadership went and visited China. I mean, I think that they are trying to, um, really take hold of this global moment and seeing where they can diversify their defense partnerships. In the short run, it's hard to see. I don't think there's one external superpower that they can fully bandwagon themselves to. I think the U.S. is still the obvious is still the most. Um, they're still stuck within a U.S. security umbrella, and I don't think that breaking out of that immediately would serve their interests in any ways. But I think longer term, they're going to want to diversify some of these defense alliances.
can we talk a little bit about this security umbrella? Because, the war, like from one perspective, and I think I'm largely convinced by this framework, revealed that there isn't that much of a security umbrella, right? The trade-off of having all these American bases in the Arab Gulf countries was that supposedly it made these countries immune from Iranian attack. And what we've seen in the last month and a half is, well, I don't want to overstate it, catastrophic or at least really significant attacks on infrastructure in the Gulf. As far as I can tell, pretty catastrophic and effective attacks on the American basing infrastructure itself, which suggests that these bases were not a deterrent to attack, and nor are they effectively a security umbrella for these Gulf countries. So how does to the extent you have insight into this from your work, how does this look to the Gulf? Do they will they feel compelled to double down on their alliance with the United States? Will they feel like they've sort of been bilked by a very expensive alliance structure that didn't actually come to their defense?
Yeah. Yeah. So, look, the region, um, for effectively most of its modern history, has always depended on some sort of external security guarantor, or whether it be the British or later then the Americans. Um, Now, I think you're absolutely right that the American bases, which were supposed to be a source of stability, have now become you know, the risk itself. And I think that they're gonna have to think this through. I'm sure those conversations are already happening. Um, and you're absolutely right that this the idea of this security umbrella was not what um, didn't turn out to be what people thought it was. And I don't want to be too get too constructivist here, but yes, in addition to the physical material bases and the Fifth Fleet and all this stuff, there's an idea of a of a U.S. security umbrella that gets invoked by heads of states, by policymakers, by defense analysts, which you know uh, which we think is more real than it actually is. And we actually only know what the umbrella is when it gets tested, which we've been seeing in the past 5 years, which hasn't really held up. So, for example, in 2016, when there was infrastructural attack on the Saudis, and Trump, and then also in 2019, and Trump basically said, "This is an attack on Saudi Arabia. It's not an attack against us." I mean, I think that raised alarm bells across the region, right? That this what they thought was this security umbrella is not what it actually is. And I think in addition to just American military bases, we're also seeing that, and this ties back earlier to the development points that we are talking about. Even things like hosting U.S. Related data centers, right, or American financial institutions can also be a source of risk, right? Even Iranian missiles and drones attacked Amazon, an AWS run data center in Bahrain and the UAE, and Amazon had to tell its customers to basically transfer their security and their data to other data centers in the region. So it's not just the U.S. security umbrella that can be a sort of risk, but it's also just integration to this larger U.S. security technological order as well. Now, the question of what they will do, I think, is really important, and I think we'll just have to see how it plays out. I think, as I said previously, I think in the medium to long term, they're going to want to forge new partnerships with new middle powers. But I think in the immediate short term, it's hard to see how they would disentangle themselves from this larger U.S. led military infrastructure, right? I don't think that the bases are going to go immediately, and they still require missile interceptors. Um, and I've been seeing that the UAE, for example, has signed a new contract with a South Korean company for missile interceptors. But by and large, they've somewhat been locked into a kind of U.S. security infrastructure.
I mean, there's a couple of assumptions that I'm not sure hold up, although I don't see what the replacement for them is. So one assumption is that the U.S. simply can't disengage from this huge basing infrastructure in the Gulf. I've been a long time arguer. I've for a long time argued that the U.S. should and must dismantle its basing infrastructure in the Gulf because of the moral hazard it creates and because it essentially locks the U.S. into a lot of conflicts that it then is sort of consigned to being involved in. But anyway, the assumption of analysts who focus on this has been that there simply isn't an alternative to American military hegemony in the Gulf for the Gulf states themselves. That the sort of fear among American hawks that if America draws down in the Gulf, that China will fill the Gulf. That in fact, that China's not interested in playing that role. That there isn't another state that can come in and sell those huge weapon systems or replace them with its own alternatives. And similarly, the sort of shift that you talked about a second ago to sort of broadening the web of relationships with middle powers, that is a kind of a different story, right? That doing so is inevitable in a smart policy and doesn't actually shift this sort of superstructure of the relationship to the hegemonic military power. So I'm not sure. I think that assumption holds up anymore, but I'm not sure what it looks like when it declines. when U.S. dominance declines. And the other related assumption is that the Gulf powers had shrewdly uh, integrated themselves with Iran's economy as well as with the U.S. economy, right? So that over decades, if not centuries, through trade and through sanctions evasion and many different mechanisms, the Gulf powers had made themselves indispensable to the United States, to weak states around the Arab world, and to Iran, and that therefore was their real insurance against being drawn into any kind of regional war. And that assumption clearly has proven untrue. And I'm honestly not sure what to make of that because that made more sense to me than the sort of great power analysis behind that first assumption. And it turns out that it did not. It didn't. The sort of economic ties did not trump the strategic questions that this war put on the table.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say on the first point, right? So I think that we should like disaggregate things a little bit. So, um, there were always these arguments being used. I don't know if I would want to say in bad faith, but arguments were always used to make the point that the U.S. has to have a strong security presence in the Middle East and the Gulf, right? And I think that there's actually a sort of contradiction in them. One of them was, as you said, the assumption that there is no alternative, right? And so that the U.S. has to stay here because it has some sort of obligation to. On the other hand, you also heard sometimes like, oh well, if the U.S. doesn't provide military aid and defense to this region, Russia will or China will, and that's why the U.S. has to do it. Right now, they're based on actually entirely different assumptions, but they try to make the same argument that the U.S. needs to be in the region. I think that if we want to just like be serious about this, I think you're absolute. I think how I would come down about it is that there is no we don't have to buy this assumption that there is no alternative. Clearly there are a whole set of alternatives, but the way I think about it is in terms of sort of sequencing. So I think in the near future it's not quite clear what that alternative would be, right? And that I think that um, as I said, disentangling the Gulf from um, a U.S. Security architecture is not that easy in the immediate short term. But I think that what these new partnerships with places like Egypt, Pakistan, Turkey, defense agreements with South Korea, China, etc., what they show is a sort of kind of medium to long term vision of diversification and hedging, right? And maybe then we will see some changes on the question of American bases. And then your second point about the economic ties trumping the street, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that that's what makes this war all the more unstable and unpopular in the region, and just a basically a strategic catastrophe in that I think an administration with a sounder approach to the strategy of the region would recognize that these economic ties are actually doing something,
A
and that
U.S. administration, you mean?
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But they've basically effectively just blown it up.
So can the Gulf recover? I mean, this safetyist or sort of safety dependent oasis model, and also the costs of rebuilding things from the natural gas infrastructure in Qatar that's been hit to the many other. I mean, I actually don't really have a clear picture of how extensive and serious the infrastructure damage is. And I mean, these are countries that have been in a building boom for decades. So I wonder if, will they sort of snap to an incredibly fast recovery once the bombs stop falling, or is this damage serious enough that it will create a years long a years long pause in their growth trajectory.
I think in the immediate future, like in terms of this year, the next 6 months, there's obviously an immediate hit to their economies. There's no doubt about it. It's already happened and will continue to happen. I think the Gulf will recover. The question is just how and in what way and what are the trade offs. So there's been fears, for example, that the Gulf is running out of money or that it's going to sell all its assets on its sovereign wealth funds, etc. I think that these are basically overblown. There is, of course, regional variation. So I want to highlight that. I think places like Qatar and the UAE and Kuwait have an extraordinary amount of surpluses that they don't need to sell off their assets in some sort of fire sale because that would actually hurt them more than anyone else. And as we've seen, they've continued to be able to borrow from both private borrowers and on debt markets at relatively low rates. And they've still maintained generally pretty positive credit ratings. So, in terms of immediate fiscal needs, I don't see anything too crazy there. Um, but of course, something's got to give somewhere, right? So I think what we could possibly see is somewhat of a slowdown in large foreign investments in the future. Some of this we're seeing from Saudi Arabia already. It canceled. I think it's in talks to cancel the Live Golf that it was sponsoring for a long time.
That's the golf, the alternate golf
Yes,
league that was a pet project of the Saudi royal family and of Donald Trump.
precisely. Right.
Well, that's going to be a catastrophe for mediocre aging American golfers.
Yeah. Um, but uh, but again, I think people have also confused that and and kind of come to the conclusion that the Saudis are pulling back because of the war. But actually, if you look at it, a lot of this pullback was already happening prior to the war because they realized that they can't spend. Their domestic spending was really high. They were one of the biggest borrowers in the world, especially when the price of oil was low prior to the war. So this sort of fiscal disciplining has actually been happening already. What I think you can see is that maybe Gulf states will be more selective in the investments that they make, and they might use the war as kind of rhetorical cover to be more selective in their demands, right? Because I think prior people would have always viewed them, especially the Trump administration, viewed them as this like piggy bank that was unlimited, that it could just draw on from wherever it wanted. I think now the Gulf can make a credible argument that to say, hey, we have our own stuff to deal with, so we're going to be a lot more selective in how we invest our money.
Is there
Um,
is there a factor in this that affects the United States government's ability to borrow money, treasuries that are sold to Gulf monarchies?
yeah, it's so um, basically no. If you look at the holders of U.S. Treasuries, the Gulf states combined are about 2 to 3%. So it's actually quite a low figure. If you compare that with Japan, which is the biggest holder of U.S. Treasuries, that's about 13%.
Oh, that's interesting.
The second biggest holder is actually the United Kingdom. So the Gulf states are not as big of holders of U.S. Treasuries as they once were. That's not because money is no longer flowing to the US. It's actually because money from the Gulf, instead of going into US treasuries, is actually going into US equities, meaning money on the stock market or money to buy private companies that could be based in the US, for example.
So if there's like a liquidity crunch or just a sort of a fiscal disciplining underway, how does that affect um, much smaller economies like Lebanon or Syria or Gaza, places or Egypt, the many places around the Arab region that are in perpetual crisis and which are incredibly sensitive to shifts in both Gulf lending, but also and remittances from the Gulf, but also direct aid, which I think often in some of these war-torn places is the difference between mere survival and like a halfway decent life for war-shattered communities.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely this is going to be one field where um, you might start seeing funding dry up. In terms of whatever, and especially this is how short-sighted the administration was, whatever, the destruction post 2023 that the US thought that the Gulf would pay for might not come to fruition in the way that envisioned, because now the Gulf will need to focus on its own domestic infrastructure spending, its own increased defense spending, support for its own economies. Now, I would say one thing though, which is that um, if we are to see a drying up of humanitarian aid or investments in the rest of the Middle East, uh, it might not be because of immediate um, fiscal problems in the Gulf or because the Gulf has a lack of money. It's actually more of a political shift. And you could kind of see this in terms of in the past 10 years, especially as the Gulf has focused much more on its own domestic developmental ambitions, right? Vision 2030, etc. It's not that they didn't have the money, right? I mean, in Saudi Arabia is a slightly different case, but it's not that they didn't have the money. It's just that they could now use these the domestic economic projects as a justification for why they were no longer going to be giving unconditional aid to countries like Egypt or Lebanon or Palestine, etc. And I think that you'll probably see this one more time, depending on how this war shapes up, where the political argument that it's going to be very difficult for um, some Gulf policymakers to argue for more aid to other countries in the Middle East, because others will always say, "Well, we need to focus on ourselves first," right? So I think Gulf states can probably will probably be saying that to other countries, right? To Europe or to the United States, saying you can't rely on us to pay for everything in the region, because you know you dragged us into this war, and now we have to pick up the costs of our own economies.
Yeah, I'm very interested in these moral hazard dynamics. Certainly uh, Saudi Arabia as a donor has shifted in some spaces, right? I mean, and this was most evident in Lebanon when it divested from the Sunni leaders it had propped up for decades, and it really did change politics in Lebanon. On the flip side, in Egypt, it continued to back a pretty inept dictatorship to the tune of many billions of dollars. So it hasn't across the board sort of modernized its political aid to Arab client states, but there has been a shift. And I guess even in a place like Egypt, it has shifted from just giving money to the regime to trading that aid for some equity or some assets in the state, which is, I think, a shift. And certainly a lot of the reckless uh, I mean, a lot of the biggest disdain I've heard for the Gulf has come from Arab states that were living off of Gulf money and until about 20 years ago had a lot of contempt for those people who were propping them up. And they've, I think, learned the lesson that their fiscal sponsors are serious people, or at least people whose preferences need to be taken into account, and that has changed the dynamics. I'm not sure we have time to get into this in great detail, but uh, the political economy of the wider region around the Gulf, and by this I mean, from South Asia to East Africa, where there's a real web of investments in agricultural land, in I think various forms of sort of mid-level production, and then labor and remittance relationships, and I guess even sort of second tier weapons and manufacturing deals. So not like the big ticket items that are bought from the United States, but the kinds of things that maybe Gulf powers buy from India or transship and sell to these middle powers. That whole economy, I think, is very poorly understood because it's relatively fresh, right? I mean, it's sort of emerged over recent decades, and I certainly don't feel like I have a clear sense of how integrated those different spaces are and how significant that those sort of trade and political ties are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that these are obviously patterns that don't get picked up in the headline news, partly because of scale, but also because they don't directly affect the West, so to speak. Um, but yeah, I think you're right that there definitely has been a shift in how Gulf states engage with regional regional actors, uh, especially on the financial side. And again, I have been there was talk of it's the end of bailout diplomacy and the Gulf is not going to give money anymore to the region. I think that these were always kind of overblown. The Gulf is always going to be a source of, it's a surplus region. Some of that surpluses is going to get recycled to the rest of the region. But you're absolutely right that the way in which they've done it has often changed. So instead of unconditional deposits at central banks, it is often now more tied to buying particular assets or particular developmental projects. So we can see this most clearly in the case of Egypt, where the UAE, the sovereign wealth fund made basically a $35 billion investment in the UAE, in Egypt, sorry, which helped propped up the Egyptian pound and unlocked extra IMF funding. But it's not, it's contingent on um, effectively investments in particular assets in Egypt. And soon after, we saw Qatar do the same thing, right? It wanted to build some developmental project on the coast. Um, so I think we're seeing a change in style of how exactly the Gulf invests. I think that's happening in Africa too. I'm less familiar the extent of which of how exactly that's happening, but in interviews that I've done with for example, hedge funds that are based in the Gulf that work with the royal family or sovereign wealth funds, for example, you know, the story that they tell, right? Um, how much this translates to real outcomes is maybe a separate matter, but the story that they tell themselves is that um, you know they have been they think of themselves as suffering what one person called the kandura premium. This refers to the traditional dress, which is that basically everyone upcharges them because they're seen to have so much money, even in places in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think what they want to do is to be taken more seriously as serious investors who have much more strict conditions and who have better control over how money is used, to generate returns, but also to influence politics. So I think that's again, as you said, right? Like, I think that's going to be one of those things that's going to change from this war, is that the Gulf is going to be much more selective in how it invests, and it's going to make the argument that we're no longer this region full of money that we can just splash around. We are going to be a lot more strict in how we use it.
I'm tempted to finish there, but I had one more question, which is about the kind of strategic calculus going forward. And this ties to a lot of the questions we've been discussing. The Gulf powers, especially Saudi and the Emirates, have wanted at various times, very publicly, they've wanted to see Iran really put into a corner strategically, right? They have called, and I mean I think this colored the Saudi approach to the war in Yemen for a long while when they first started that war. There was a lot of maximalist thinking, right? That with the appropriate amount of force applied either by the U.S. on behalf of the Gulf states or by the Gulf states themselves, especially the UAE as it developed its own military lift capacity, the idea, as I understood it, was that if the Gulf states in alliance with the United States and eventually Israel were willing to push hard enough, they could establish a disciplining regional security order in which Iran was put into a corner, put into a box, sort of marginalized, and a sort of commercial and military order could emerge that would be very beneficial to these Gulf countries. Now, I think that thinking was always based on a faulty assumption that Iran was weak when in fact it is fairly strong, especially when it comes to power in its within its borders and in its near neighborhood. And we saw a similar kind of reality check emerge in the war with the Houthis, right? Where Saudi Arabia believed that if it sort of called the question, it could destroy or completely marginalize the Houthis. And in fact, it found that the Houthis were the natural power base of the Houthis grew stronger as a result of the conflict. And now there's a much more, I would say, realist balancing act underway in which Saudi Arabia understands it can't antagonize these players. Now it's having to these Gulf powers or Arab Gulf powers are having to learn that lesson again with Iran. I'm wondering if you have a sense of what a real kind of entente looks like across the Persian Gulf between Iran and the Arab Gulf monarchies, and what a sort of viable what a viable order actually looks like if we ever can get past this kind of zero sum imagineering that leads to gambles, reckless gambles like the war that's underway right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's hard to immediately imagine what would that would look like in the context of the war, despite the current ceasefire. But I mean, just to say this very briefly, I mean, I think that you're absolutely right that probably post 2011 there was this very, I mean, it has its older roots, after the Iraq war, but even before that, of very much a maximalist thinking, on behalf of the Gulf towards Iran. And I think that really came to, it was at its peak during the JCPOA in 2015. How enraged the Gulf states were with that, how they
And how they
basically
worked hard to actually undermine that deal.
precisely, and how they basically pressured the Obama administration in authorizing them to go into Yemen, using JCPOAs to say, okay, we're if you're going to do the JCPOA, fine, but then you have to, basically let us go into Yemen. So,
To clarify what you're saying,
yeah,
if we let you make a diplomatic deal with Iran, you have to let us start a new equally destabilizing war in Yemen to cancel it out.
right, right, yeah, along those lines. Um, and I think, but as we spoke about earlier, I think the fact that when Gulf states got hit by Iran or the Houthis, and the U.S. was not the security guarantor that it thought it was, that there was a definite evolution in strategic thinking, away from the maximalist position. This was always more so in the case of Saudi Arabia than the UAE, but I think both of them moved in that direction, and we saw especially with the 2023, I think it was, détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But again, now we're seeing a bit of a slight bit of divergence again, where with the UAE taking a slightly more maximalist position towards Iran compared to the UAE, compared to Saudi Arabia. But I think ultimately, look, there has to. I think any sort of like progressive administration would need to see some sort of new strategic détente in the region between Iran and the Gulf states. Um, how that would be established in practice, It's difficult to say, but I think it would rest on a couple different factors. One would be, basically getting some sort of new Iran deal, actually, right? Some sort of new version of the JCPOA where you can get Iran to accept some conditions. It has to be able to, Gulf states need to be able to feel that they need to feel that they're no longer going to be threatened militarily from Iran again. And the other thing needs to be basically a reining in of Israeli rogue action in the region and Israeli this idea of Israeli military supremacy, because I think Israel wants to effectively create a situation where it's us versus Iran, and so the Gulf states better jump on our bandwagon. But I think that that's not a helpful dichotomy or dynamic that a progressive administration would want. So one would need to ratchet down Israeli military action in the region. And then the last thing that I've been thinking about recently, and I don't know if this is right, but I think that um, if we are going to take seriously this idea of relative U.S. decline, it doesn't mean that the U.S. is not involved in the region anymore. If anything, it should actually be playing a much more constructive role. It doesn't need to be military first. It needs to be, diplomacy first, or um, the economy first, or climate first, whatever it is. And I think that there needs to be a space for more of these middle and rising powers to cooperate with the United States and to cooperate with Gulf states and Iran on securing peace in the region, especially China, for example. I think China probably needs to play a much greater role in the region because the Strait of Hormuz is important for China too. How this would happen, I'm not entirely sure. And of course, the risk is that you're inviting more geopolitical competition into the region. But I think that unless you have more more new avenues of geopolitical cooperation, I don't see how we're going to have a sort of sustainable and lasting peace in this part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, when we say look for diplomatic and political solutions instead of military solutions, that's another way of saying states need to accept compromises that include some unsavory elements, right? I mean, this is like the heart of the Iran nuclear deal was that its signatories accepted that Iran would be a military bully in some departments, but not in the nuclear space. And to some extent, understandably, the countries that were victims of Iranian expansionism didn't like that. They didn't want Iranian-sponsored militias to be able to hurt them in conventional ways in exchange for nuclear peace. But this again, this is what diplomacy and compromise look like. And my sense over now watching these conflicts evolve and deepen over several cycles is that there is a spreading zone of this kind of zero-sum absolutist approach and a increasing disinterest in factoring in the enormous destruction and human cost of gambling on for sort of absolute domination rather than compromise. So, that kind of extremist thinking colored the U.S. invasion of Iraq, has colored a lot of Israel's wars in the region. It's also colored Iran's pretty toxic interventions in places like Iraq and Syria and maybe elsewhere. I would say it colored the Saudi invasion of Yemen, the UAE's really ghastly interventions in the Sudan war. So there's like a growing coterie of powers, international and regional, that are really willing to make life terrible for millions of people in pursuit of a kind of chimera, some kind of total security outcome or total dominance outcome that just by the odds is like a very, very slim possible outcome, like very unlikely to come to pass. And they say, well, what's the downside of pushing for this? We still get some kind of power in our view, and the people who are suffering aren't us. And my sense is that's starting to change, right? This war has democratized, or if not democratized, has really much more widely distributed the human costs and the costs to elites of this kind of reckless, reckless pursuit of war-based, I'd say, policy gambling. And maybe this will lead to some of the kinds of moves that I think will create the foundations for the kind of outcome you're talking about, right? So like a shrinking of the American military footprint, an increasing willingness of wealthy Gulf monarchies to negotiate in a long-term way with Iran and others. I hope it will lead to a restraint of Israel's destructive maximalism in the region. And if these trends do come to pass, they will take 5 or 10 or 15 years to start coming to fruition. And they can't depend on a progressive U.S. administration, right? They'll depend on a kind of realism seeping into left and right politics in the U.S. and Europe and in other important regional powers, so that there's wider buy-in to compromise.
Yeah, I think that's wonderfully put. Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is, you know, region escalation and conflict is often thought of as, I mean, on the one hand there can be an ideological aspect to it of, particularly hawkish administrations being in power, but it's also sometimes because of some broader collective action problem, right? And that you escalate because if you don't escalate, the other person's going to escalate. And I think war can sometimes be the great leveler, unfortunately. But what you said about the cost being distributed also to elites, I think is a fantastic point, where this is no longer small zones of the quote unquote unimportant parts of the world. These are affecting crucial parts of the world that are important for the global economy. And I think that it hopefully will spur these states into action. And you're absolutely right that this won't just depend on a progressive US administration as much as we would like that to be the case. It will be because of a broader realism across all states where they need to be able to compromise. And I think it is war and the memories of war that are often the important motivators for that.
Rohan, thanks so much for sharing some of your insights into what's happening in the Gulf. I've been talking to Rohan Advani, a fellow at Century International and also a PhD candidate at UCLA, who's been studying the financial tools of state power. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, director of Century International, and you've been listening to the Order from Ashes podcast. Rohan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Thanasi.
See you all next week.